The night I came home from the airport, my daughter made pot roast. My favorite. She stood in the kitchen wearing an apron, her hair pulled back, her face soft with the kind of love that used to feel like the safest thing in the world. My son-in-law Derek carried my suitcase in from the car and set it at the foot of the stairs. He put one hand on my shoulder and said, "Welcome home, Pop. You look better. Florida must have done you some good." I smiled and told him I felt great. Then I sat down at my own dining room table, picked up my fork, and cut a small piece of meat. I brought it to my mouth, chewed slowly, and let most of it fall quietly into the napkin when I turned to cough. Neither of them noticed. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't care anymore. Across the table, my daughter Cassie watched me eat with exactly the kind of gentle attention a loving daughter gives a sick old father. Patient. Warm. Patient the way a person is patient when they are simply waiting for something to end. What Derek and Cassie did not know, sitting across from me in my own house that Thursday evening, was that there were 4 cameras hidden in this room, that 2 state detectives and an assistant state attorney had already reviewed 47 pages of evidence against them, that a warrant was already signed and sitting on a detective's desk less than 20 miles away. They thought I had just come home from a vacation. They did not know I had spent 11 days watching them through a neighbor's window. And they did not know that the following morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, their plan was going to collapse around them in my foyer while I stood at the top of my staircase in pajamas and watched. But before I tell you how that morning went, let me take you back to where this really started. Because the betrayal did not begin with a brown bottle in a kitchen cabinet. It began with a sentence I said in love, in a room full of quiet afternoon light, while holding a coffee mug my late wife had bought years ago. "I am Warren Calloway. I am 68 years old. I spent 35 years as a structural engineer, and I know better than most that a building does not collapse all at once. It fails slowly. One small crack, one overlooked stress point. One morning you walk in and the ceiling is already gone." My wife Helen died in 2015. Pancreatic cancer. 7 months from diagnosis to the end. And every one of those months she spent being more concerned about me than about herself. She was the kind of woman who noticed things before they needed to be said. The kind who would have touched my face at breakfast, looked at my eyes, and known something was wrong before I opened my mouth. When she was gone, I lost more than my wife. I lost my witness. For 6 years after the funeral, I lived alone in the house we had shared for over 3 decades. It was a big house for one man, too many quiet rooms, too many chairs no one sat in. But it was paid off, it was ours, and I was not ready to let it go. Then my daughter Cassie called me from Cincinnati, where she and Derek had been living for 4 years, and told me Derek had lost his job. He had been in pharmaceutical sales. The way he explained it, the company had restructured. His region had been cut. There was nothing he could have done differently. It was never his fault, and somehow it never had been in all the time I had known him. Bad luck followed Derek the way weather follows certain people, always arriving just in time to explain why nothing had worked out. But Cassie loved him, and Cassie was all I had left. So when she asked if they could move back home while they got back on their feet, I said yes without hesitating. I walked into the kitchen that afternoon, picked up Helen's old coffee mug, and called Cassie back. "Come home, sweetheart," I told her. "The house is yours someday anyway." I thought I was being generous. I did not understand until much later that Derek was in the next room when I said those words. That he heard that sentence the way a man hears a starting gun. That in his mind, the only thing standing between him and the house was the inconvenient fact that I was still alive in it. They moved in that September. Cassie took her old bedroom. Derek claimed the den as his office, though I rarely heard him on calls or saw anything that looked like actual work. He spent most days on his laptop and most evenings on his phone, always vague about what exactly he was pursuing. I told myself he was regrouping. I told myself job searches take time. I told myself not every man finds his footing at the same speed. What I was really doing was talking myself out of my instincts. For the first several months, things seemed manageable. I paid the mortgage, taxes, utilities, and insurance. Cassie and Derek handled groceries. Cassie worked part-time at a children's bookstore downtown. Derek kept mentioning consulting leads that never became actual consulting work. And then, last March, my body started to fail. It began with my hand. Just a tremble in the morning when I reached for coffee. The cup would rattle against the saucer, and I would stare at my own fingers like they belonged to someone else. I blamed it on too much caffeine, then on not enough sleep, then on the stress of living with people I did not know as well as I thought I did. Then came the nausea. An hour after dinner, I would be upstairs gripping the toilet, throwing up until my ribs ached. Cassie would knock softly on the bathroom door and ask if I was all right. I would tell her I was fine, because that is what stubborn old men say when they are not fine, and they do not want anyone to know it. By July, I had lost 23 pounds. My hair came out in the shower in wet clumps. My right hand shook badly enough that I stopped writing checks, and when Cassie offered to take over the household bills, I handed them to her. I told myself it was practical. I told myself a daughter helping her sick father with paperwork was not something to feel ashamed of. What I did not understand yet was that I had just handed her the keys to everything. Derek started helping me out of chairs. He started calling me Pop. He watched me with the careful, patient concern people save for someone they believe is almost done. And like a fool, I felt grateful. But the worst part was not the vomiting, and it was not the shaking hand. The worst part was what happened to my mind. One afternoon, I drove toward the hardware store on Route 9. I had made that drive 400 times. Halfway there, I pulled onto the shoulder because I could not remember where I was going. Not a foggy hesitation, not a momentary blank. Nothing. A clean white wall where a thought should have been. I sat in that parked truck with both hands on the wheel for a long time. Then I cried. 68 years old, crying alone on the side of a road, convinced my mind was leaving me the same way my body already had. What I did not know was that my mind was not leaving me. Someone was trying to push it out. My neighbor Miriam Aldridge had lived across the street for longer than I had lived in my house. She was 81 years old, widowed twice, a retired piano teacher, and sharp enough to make a much younger man feel embarrassed for underestimating her. Helen used to bring her Christmas cookies. After Helen died, Miriam kept showing up with shortbread and porch conversation and the kind of quiet attention that does not announce itself as kindness, but functions exactly that way. One Tuesday morning in late August, I walked to the mailbox in my bathrobe. That alone should tell you how far things had gone. I had shaved before breakfast every day for 40 years, but that morning, buttoning a shirt felt like too much to manage. Halfway down the driveway, my legs went soft. I grabbed the lamppost and held on. Miriam saw me from across the street. She set down her watering can, walked over without asking permission, and took my wrist in her thin hand. "Come sit on my porch," she said. I was too tired to argue. She brought me water in a sealed bottle, opened it in front of me, and watched me drink it without taking her eyes off my face. Then she sat down across from me with those pale blue eyes gone very still. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. 5 months, I said, maybe 6. "And the doctor?" I looked away. "Cassie keeps saying she'll drive me. We just haven't gotten there yet." Miriam did not say anything for a moment. Then she asked the question I was not ready for. "Who is living in that house with you, Roland?" I told her. "My daughter. Her husband." She nodded once, like I had just confirmed something she had been watching from a distance and hoping she was wrong about. Then she leaned forward and lowered her voice. "You are going to tell them I invited you to my niece's home in Florida for a week. The niece is real. She will cover for you. You will pack a bag, and Derek will drive you to the airport. You will go through every motion of a man who is leaving town, but you will not get on that plane." I stared at her. "You will spend one night near the airport," she continued. "Then I will bring you back here. You will stay in my guest room, and from my window you will watch your own house." I tried to smile, but what came out was something smaller than that. Then Miriam said, "My second husband was poisoned by his daughter. By the time I understood what I was watching, it was already too late to save him. Warren, if I am right about what is happening to you, you will be dead before the year is out. And the horrible thing was, somewhere in the part of me that had been quietly watching and quietly refusing to say it out loud, I already believed her. Before I tell you what I found when I started watching my own house, I want to ask you something. If you have stayed with this story this long, please subscribe to Eamon's Revenge Stories. It takes 1 second, and it means we can keep bringing you stories like this one. For 4 days before I left, I sat at my own table knowing there might be poison on my plate. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what it does to a man's mind to look at his own daughter carrying a plate toward him and have to decide in 3 seconds whether to eat it or pretend to eat it. Every meal became a performance. Every dinner required me to manage my face, manage my fork, manage the napkin on my lap, and manage the piece of myself that kept wanting to stand up and scream. I pushed food around the plate. I coughed into the napkin at the right moments. I spilled my coffee twice and apologized for my shaking hand. 35 years of structural engineering had taught me one thing above everything else. When you need to understand how something is failing, you do not fix it too soon. You watch it. You let the cracks show themselves. You gather every piece of information before you decide where to put your weight. Friday evening, Derek drove me to Bradley International Airport. He carried my suitcase. He held my elbow at the curb. To anyone watching, he was a devoted son-in-law, patient and careful with a fragile old man. At the terminal entrance, he hugged me and said, "Have a great trip, Pop. Send pictures." I smiled and told him I would. Then I walked inside, past the check-in lines, past the families and the business travelers, and I went through every motion a real departure would require. Then I walked back out through a different exit, got into a car I had arranged in advance, and went to a motel near the airport. I paid cash. I turned my phone off. I slept for 12 hours straight, the way a man sleeps when the tension holding him together finally lets go. Sunday at dawn, Miriam picked me up in her old Buick. She didn't talk much. I didn't either. She pulled into her garage, led me through the kitchen, and took me upstairs to her guest room. Then she pointed to the window. From behind a thin curtain, I could see my house, my driveway, my front porch, the dining room window where Helen and I had eaten dinner for more than 30 years. At first, nothing happened. Then Sunday night came. Cars began arriving around 9. Not 1 or 2. 8, 9, 10 cars lining the street, filling my driveway, rolling onto the lawn. Men and women in expensive clothes stepped out and walked toward my front door like they had standing invitations. Derek opened the door grinning, welcoming them the way a host welcomes guests to his own home. My home. Cassie followed behind him carrying a tray of drinks. My drinks, my single malt. By 10 o'clock, the dining room I was watching through Miriam's window no longer looked like my dining room. Someone had covered the table with green felt. Poker chips clicked where Helen's Sunday roast used to sit. Cards moved across the wood where I had once helped Cassie with long division. A man stood near my bar with a cash box. A woman moved between guests with a notepad. Derek worked the room, laughing, shaking hands, collecting money, moving like a man who had already decided the place was his. Then I watched him go to the garage and come back with an older man in a suit. They sat down at my dining room table, spread papers between them, and Derek pointed to the staircase, then the walls, then the bay window. He was showing him the house. My house. The man wrote something down and slid a thick envelope across the table. Derek tucked it inside his jacket. I did not know yet what was inside that envelope, but I knew enough. They were not waiting for me to die so they could inherit. They were already trying to sell the house while I was supposedly in Florida. And if I came back from that trip the way a sick old man was supposed to come back, confused and weakening and grateful for every cup of coffee someone set in front of him, there was a reasonable chance I was never going to leave that house alive again. Miriam caught my arm before I could stand. "Not yet," she said quietly. "They're selling my house," I said. "Yes, and if you go over there now, they'll deny everything. The buyer says he didn't know." Logan laughs. Cassie cries. The police make some noise about gambling, find nothing that sticks, and tomorrow you are back inside that house with people who know you suspect them. That was the moment I understood what staying silent actually meant. Not weakness, not fear, strategy. Let them finish writing their own confession, she said. So I sat back down, and I watched. Monday morning, I called Chester Fairbanks, my old college roommate, a retired corporate attorney, and the most careful man I had ever known. I told him everything from the Sunday night gambling party to the man with the envelope. Chester listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Warren, do not call the police yet. Call a private investigator named Grady Sutton. He's expensive, he's quiet, and if your phone is in that guest room, keep it on silent every second of every day." Grady Sutton arrived at Miriam's back door Monday afternoon. He looked like an accountant, soft-spoken, unremarkable, the kind of man who disappears the moment he steps out of a room. Chester had told me one thing before hanging up. Trust him. By Monday evening, I understood why. While Cassie and Derek were out, Grady accessed the house through the basement bulkhead and installed 4 small cameras, one in the kitchen, one in the dining room, one in the living room, one in Derek's office. He hid a small cellular router in the attic, so the footage streamed directly to a laptop in Miriam's guest room. That night, I watched my own house from a window across the street. And what I saw over the next 11 days changed me in ways I am still trying to understand. I watched Cassie stand at the kitchen counter, glance over her shoulder, open the cabinet above the refrigerator, and take out a small brown bottle. She added 1 drop to the coffee mug I had used every morning for years. She did it Tuesday. She did it Wednesday. She did it Thursday. Not a handful of pills, not something dramatic, 1 drop, careful, practiced, quiet, as a held breath. I watched Derek pace his office with his phone to his ear, saying, "He's not going to make it through November. We just need him to sign the medical directive first." Then he laughed, not nervously, not uncomfortably. He laughed the way a man laughs when he is already certain of the outcome. I watched a man in a cheap suit arrive at the back door, hand Derek a notarized document, and receive cash in return. I watched Derek slide that document into a folder he kept in his desk, a folder with my name on the tab. My name, sitting in his desk like a file waiting to be closed. By the second weekend, Grady had assembled 47 pages of evidence, time-stamped video, audio recordings, transcripts, forged documents, a fake power of attorney Logan had been using to prepare the sale of my home to a property investor named Clive Mercer out of New Haven. The buyer specialized in distressed homes and desperate situations. My home was not distressed, I was, and Derek was counting on no one noticing the difference in time. But I need to tell you about one particular moment, because in 11 days of footage, there was one thing I saw that hurt worse than all the rest of it put together. It was the second Saturday night, while the gambling party was running in my house again. Cars lined the street. Music came through the walls. Strangers moved through my kitchen with my glasses in their hands. On Grady's laptop, the kitchen camera showed Cassie standing alone at the counter. The party noise was behind her, but she was perfectly still, sober, staring at nothing. Then she reached up to the cabinet above the refrigerator and took out the brown bottle. She held it in her hand and did not move. From behind Miriam's curtain, I stopped breathing. Part of me needed her to put it down. Part of me still needed to believe that somewhere inside the woman standing in my kitchen, the little girl I had raised, was still alive. And then she did. She put the bottle back in the cabinet. She did not add anything to the coffee that night, and instead of relief, I felt something break open, because that moment proved she knew. Not because Logan told her to and she obeyed without understanding. She knew exactly what was in that bottle. She had chosen to use it again and again, and on that one night she chose not to, which meant every other time it had been a deliberate choice. One night without poison did not save her in my heart. It showed me she had one, and had been choosing to ignore it. Chester reviewed Grady's file first. Then he made a call to someone he still knew at the state attorney's office, and within a day that office had brought in the Connecticut State Police. I sat in a conference room in Meriden with two detectives, an assistant state attorney, Chester and Grady Avery. I looked like a sick old man held together by borrowed resolve. My hands were still trembling, my stomach was still weak. My body still carried whatever Cassie had been feeding me for months. But my mind, for the first time in half a year, was entirely clear. Detective Renata Voss led the meeting. She had the kind of face that had looked at every ugly thing people are capable of doing to each other, and had decided not to look away. She let Grady play the recordings without interrupting once. Cassie at the counter, the brown bottle, the drop in the coffee. Derek on the phone. He's not going to make it through November. When the footage ended, Detective Voss tapped the folder once with her finger. Then she said, "We've got them." And just like that, my fear became a case. The plan Detective Voss laid out was simple, in the way that precision is simple. Every piece had to move at the right moment. I would return home from Florida exactly when Cassie and Derek expected me. I would act tired, confused, and weak. I would let them believe their plan was still on schedule. And then Friday morning, the police would come through the front door. Detective Voss looked at me across the table and said, "If she puts something in front of you, don't drink it. We need the evidence, Warren. We don't need you dead." Thursday evening, Derek was waiting at the airport curb. He smiled when he saw me, carried the bag, put one hand on my elbow at the curb. "Welcome home, Pop," he said. "You look better. Florida must have been good for you." I smiled back. "It was," I said. "I feel a lot better, son." The word son nearly choked me. When we pulled into the driveway, Cassie came out the front door before the car had fully stopped. She was wearing an apron. Her face was soft. She kissed my forehead and said, "Daddy, I missed you so much." She had made pot roast. My favorite. I sat down at the dining room table, where Helen and I had eaten for over 30 years, where I had helped a little girl with her homework, where two people had spread green felt over the wood and dealt cards to strangers. Cassie placed the plate in front of me. Derek watched from the side. I picked up my fork. I cut a small piece. I brought it to my mouth, chewed slowly, let most of it fall into the napkin when I coughed. Then I looked at my daughter and said, "Perfect as always, sweetheart." And she smiled back at me like she had not spent 6 months helping to write an ending she believed I would not survive. I barely slept that night. My stomach twisted. Every sound in that house felt too loud. The pipes, the floorboards, Derek moving around downstairs at midnight, Cassie opening cabinets in the kitchen before the sun came up, because some habits are hard to break even on the last morning they can do any harm. At 5 minutes before 8, I stood at the top of the staircase in my pajamas. I heard the engines outside first, not one, several. Derek walked to the front door in his bathrobe, already irritated before he even opened it. At exactly 8 o'clock, the knock came. 3 sharp hits on my own front door. Derek opened it. Detective Voss stepped inside with officers behind her. She held up the warrant and said, "Derek Wexler, step aside." For the first time in all the years I had known him, Derek had no smile ready. He looked at the warrant. He looked at the officers behind her. Then he turned and looked up at me on the landing. He was not shocked. That is what I remember most clearly. He was angry. The mask he had worn in my house for 2 years dropped from his face, and what was underneath it was cold and flat and already calculating who else to blame. Then he said, "You son of a bitch." I held the banister. I looked him in the eye. "Yes, Derek," I said, "I am." Behind him, Cassie came out of the kitchen with a coffee cup in her hand. She saw the police. She saw Derek frozen in the doorway. Then she looked up and saw me standing at the top of the stairs, alive and aware and waiting. The cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the hardwood floor. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She stood with her hands at her sides, looking up at me like a woman who had been waiting 6 months for exactly this to arrive. When the officers moved toward her, she whispered, "Daddy, please." If you have stayed with this story this far, please subscribe to Eamon's Revenge Stories before I tell you how this ended. Your support is what makes it possible for us to keep bringing you stories about betrayal, justice, and the kind of karma that is a long time coming. They arrested Derek first. He stood in my foyer with his hands behind his back and his jaw tight, looking at me like I had betrayed him by surviving. Even in handcuffs, he looked less ashamed than inconvenienced. Cassie was different. When the officers turned toward her, she broke completely. Her face collapsed. Tears came fast and ugly and desperate. She looked smaller than I had seen her in years, like a child who had broken something she could not put back together and was only now realizing how permanent that was. "Daddy," she whispered, "please." I wish I could tell you I felt strong in that moment. Righteous, vindicated. I didn't. I sat down on the top stair, put my face in my hands, and cried like a man who had just lost his only child. Because in every way that mattered, I had. The trial took 8 months. Derek received 22 years. Attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, forgery, and operating an illegal gambling establishment out of my home. The judge described him as a man who had traded every human quality for calculation, and he had run out of things to trade. Derek sat at the defense table with the same blank expression he had worn in my foyer, already miles away from any of it. Cassie took a plea agreement, 12 years. Her attorney argued that Derek had controlled her, manipulated her, that she had been isolated and frightened. The prosecutor did not argue back. She simply asked the court to watch the footage. My daughter standing at the kitchen counter. The brown bottle. The drop in my coffee. 41 times caught on camera. The courtroom went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary silence. I visited Cassie once after sentencing. She picked up the phone and cried and told me she was sorry. And I believe she was. Regret has a sound that is different from performance. And what I heard through that phone was real. I told her the truth. I forgive you the way a father forgives, but I will not be in your life anymore. Not visits, not letters, not parole hearings. Loving you nearly cost me everything, and I do not have another life to spend on it. Then I walked out. I sold the house. I could not live there anymore. A young couple with 2 daughters bought it, and I hope they fill every room with arguments about homework and birthday cake and the kind of noise a family makes when it is actually whole. I bought a small camper. I drive. I fish. I sleep with the windows open when the weather is kind. And sometimes I stop at a diner and sit at the counter and order coffee just because I can. Derek lost the house he tried to steal. Cassie lost the father who would have handed her the world if she had simply asked for it. And I lost a daughter. But I kept my life. Some people call that revenge. I call it finally waking up before the ceiling came down. Now I pour my own coffee. And for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I am not afraid to drink it. If this story stayed with you, tell me in the comments below. Would you have stayed silent and waited for the proof? Or would you have confronted them the moment you knew? And if you believe that quiet patience is sometimes the only weapon that actually works, subscribe to Eamon's Revenge Stories for more stories about betrayal, survival, and the kind of justice that takes its time.